All right. It is the top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and get us started here. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Us Stories webinar series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Glad you can join us for today's webinar. The chat is open to all, so feel free to go ahead and type amongst yourselves if you have questions or comments. A little bit of housekeeping stuff before we get started. So today's webinar is part one of a two-part series sharing the latest research from the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, which has been bringing scientists, planners, policymakers, and others together for nearly a decade to identify and collaboratively fill priority blue carbon data gaps for Pacific Northwest coastal wetlands. You'll hear more detail from members of the project team in just a moment. Before we get started, like I said, I've got a little bit of housekeeping stuff to walk through, which includes an introduction to the reserve system, the science collaborative, and this webinar series. If you haven't already done so, please feel free to let other folks in the audience know a bit more about yourself. You can chat your name and, if applicable, affiliation or where you're joining us from today. So, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. It's a national network of 30 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve includes programs focused on the activities you see on the slide, which include land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs to the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. The webinar series features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. And if that sounds interesting to you, please join us for future webinars to learn about new methods to integrate experts and users into the research process and how their research results and products might inform your work. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. All attendees are muted upon entry, and we will be handling presentation-related questions via Zoom's Q&A feature. You can enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar, and we'll try to discuss as many as we can during that final portion of today's call as well. Chat is visible to all, so like I said, please use it to talk amongst yourselves and ask organizers support or technical questions. So, to tell us more about blue carbon research in the Pacific Northwest, we'll be hearing from 4 people who have been doing this work. Joining us today are Chris Janousek, a research professor at Oregon State University, Trevor Williams, a faculty research assistant at Oregon State University, Katrina Poppe, a research associate at Western Washington University and a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, and Scott Bridgham, an emeritus professor at the University of Oregon. And to get us started, Craig Cornu, who has served as the PI on a number of blue carbon projects supported by the Science Collaborative, will set the stage by telling us about the context and the need for this most recent work. Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. As Nick said, I'm Craig Cornu. I'm with the Oregon's Institute for Applied Ecology, and I've been coordinating the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group for a while now, since about 2015. And the working group is a diverse group of scientists, coastal planners, et cetera. And we've been taking a collaborative approach to filling blue carbon data gaps since about 2015. With the help of the NERRS Science Collaborative, we've organized these 2 webinars to share results of our working group activities, which might be of interest to people. Just a little bit more about today's webinar. We're going to be focusing on the results of our latest 3-year multi-site blue carbon research project, and we'll also be touching on some of our previous work. And as Nick mentioned, there's another webinar that happens next week at this same time, and that's going to focus on climate mitigation tools and policy initiatives that our data have actually begun to facilitate in the Pacific Northwest. So we're in a nice spot where we've filled data gaps, and we're now able to start using those data. So with that, let's get started with Chris, who will be telling us about his development and ongoing curation of the working group's blue carbon database, which really ties all of this research and data application work together. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Craig. So I'm Chris. I'm from Oregon State University, and I'll be kind of doing the first segment of our series of talks today. And I'll be focusing on the soil carbon stock aspect of the work that we've been doing. So blue carbon is just one of many reasons why we value coastal ecosystems, including estuaries. But it's of sort of growing interest with policymakers and managers and scientists over the last decade or two. When I think about blue carbon, I think about four different dimensions to blue carbon. So the first is quantifying, and then from a management perspective, conserving existing blue carbon stocks. The next is measuring coastal sequestration. Third is thinking about greenhouse gas emissions from tidal wetlands, particularly methane. And then fourth is determining lateral fluxes of carbon between ecosystems. So I'm going to focus today on the stocks piece, and you'll hear a little bit more about sequestration and gas emissions from the next speakers. So the working group was funded beginning in 2016 for what we're sort of calling our phase 1 project, which is to understand carbon stocks in tidal wetlands in the Pacific Northwest. We had two major questions. One was, how do stocks differ between different kinds of blue carbon ecosystems? And how do stocks vary with important environmental drivers in estuaries? For this project, this was a Science Collaborative funded project. We had 34 sites in 9 estuaries from Northern California up to Washington, as you can see on the map on the right. And at each site, we sampled 6 locations. We sampled the soil carbon as well as the above and below ground biomass of each of these systems. And we focused on 3 major types of tidal wetlands: seagrass meadows, tidal marsh, so we looked at both low and high marshes, and then forested tidal swamps, which are kind of a unique ecosystem in the Pacific Northwest. These are freshwater and brackish tidal wetlands that have very saturated soils and tend to be dominated by Sitka spruce or other woody species. Just to wrap up an entire 3-year project in one slide, these are the results of our work on our stocks project. On the figure on the left, you can see the total ecosystem carbon stocks in megagrams per hectare in 4 of our wetland classes: seagrass, low marsh, high marsh, and tidal forest. And there's a clear elevation gradient that as you go down lower in the intertidal frame to our seagrass meadows, we have lower stocks. And as you move up into the high marsh and tidal forest, one finds higher carbon stocks. We also found that the vast majority of the carbon was located in the soil. So with the exception of tidal forests, where maybe a quarter of the total carbon is in the plant biomass, most of the carbon in these ecosystems is actually found in the soil profile. We began to look as well at some of the key environmental drivers of these patterns. And I've just showed one figure here just to give you a flavor of what we're looking at. But we looked at factors such as elevation, pH of the sediments, and salinity, and how those have impacted carbon and nitrogen densities. So the panels to focus on the figure on the right are the left 4 panels. This goes from surface soils down to about 1 meter depth. And this figure just shows the relative importance of these environmental factors in determining the carbon density that we see. So in a lot of cases, elevation was one of the most important drivers of these patterns. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go more into these details, but we have one paper out and another forthcoming on this study. So one of the other goals of the Stocks project was to start a blue carbon database for the Pacific Northwest. We established that in about 2018, and we began with our data set that I've just shown you, as well as a couple of other data sets we knew from the Pacific Northwest. And then we gradually expanded our work into California, Mexico, British Columbia, and Alaska. So the database today is a living database. We're incorporating new data whenever that becomes available. And to date, we mostly focus right now on soil carbon and nitrogen stocks, although we do have sequestration rate data and are going to be adding our greenhouse gas emissions data to the database as well. One of the neat things about working across such a large geography is that we really have a wide range of environmental conditions. We have strong gradients in precipitation across the Western North America, changes in temperature, tide range, as well as the plant communities that occur in our tidal estuaries. One of the things that we've tried to do with the database, not just pull all this data together, but actually as scientists try to make some sense of the large set of data that we have and look for patterns. We decided about a few years ago to conduct a regional synthesis of carbon stocks in all of these ecosystems from Mexico to Alaska. The goal was similar to our initial stocks project. One, we wanted to know how stocks differ between blue carbon ecosystem types. Second, how they vary with environmental drivers. And then also because we have such a broad geography here, we wanted to look at the spatial scales of variability in carbon stocks. We looked at the three of the same wetland types that I showed before: seagrass, emergent marsh, and then the temperate tidal swamps of the Northwest. And we expanded the database to also include tide flats dominated by algae or maybe sparse vascular plants, and then mangroves once you get into Baja California. We compiled data from 71 different data sets. This was really a pleasant surprise. We thought maybe we'd find a dozen or so blue carbon data sets for our region, but found well over that. And that data set included nearly 1,300 soil cores that were at least 20 centimeters in depth. The spatial coverage of our analysis was over 6,500 kilometers of coastline and included 86 distinct estuaries or kind of coastal regions that have been intensively sampled. We used a standardized approach to determine carbon density and bulk density, percent organic carbon, and percent organic matter with depth. And all the percent organic matter we converted into percent carbon based on region-specific relationships. And then we integrated all these data down to 30, 50, and 100 centimeters depth for comparison. Typically, other studies will report carbon stocks to 1 meter depth. And the two figures at the top just show the distribution of our cores with geography from Alaska to southern Mexico, and then also by wetland type. So by far, we had the most samples from emergent marsh, but pretty good representation of mangroves and seagrass meadows as well. We also compiled whatever ecosystem data were available. So that included things at local scale, such as elevation, the type of estuary, sediment particle size, and plant composition, and then also variables at the regional scale. So the ecoregion, latitude, climate zone, temperature, precipitation, etc. So these, again, just to show a whole bunch of results in a handful of slides, these show the total soil carbon stocks to both 30 centimeters depth and 100 centimeters depth for the 5 wetland types that we're looking at. So these are, again, in megagrams per hectare. And for the low intertidal ecosystems, tide flats and seagrass, these, again, generally had lower stocks than the higher elevation vegetated tidal wetlands. Emergent marshes were intermediate, and the woody dominated ecosystems, mangroves and the temperate tidal swamps had the highest carbon stocks across this region. The numbers here at the bottom of the plots just show the number of samples for each wetland type. We started to look at some of the local drivers, and the data were not as extensive as the carbon stock data, but in some cases, marshes, for example, we had a lot of interesting data. So just to give you a few snapshots, this is looking at the relationship between elevation and carbon stocks. And for 3 of the wetland types here, emergent marsh, tidal swamps, and then seagrasses in the lower left, we found positive relationships between elevation and carbon stocks, but lots of scatter. So there's still lots of unexplained variation, even though elevation seems to be an important driver of blue carbon. Another thing we started to take a look at was the plant type. So for seagrasses, for instance, we had meadows that were dominated by our native Zostera marina, and then a few cores from non-native Zostera japonica. And we did find a statistically significant difference in stocks between those 2 seagrass types. Marshes were a little bit more difficult. We have many dozens of marsh plant species across the Northeast Pacific. So we use kind of an approach of lumping them into kind of functional groups and salinity classes. And here I'm showing the data for 6 kinds of marshes. We have freshwater graminoids, freshwater mixed, 2 brackish marsh assemblages, and then more saline graminoids or succulent plants. And although, again, a lot of variability in the data, there does seem to be an indication that our brackish marshes of intermediate salinity may have higher stocks than either our tidal freshwater or more saline marshes. Similarly, for mangrove, we did find some species level differences. In Mexico, there are 3 major species of mangroves, and the red mangrove, Rhizophora mango here, tended to have the higher carbon stocks than either the white or black mangrove or mixed assemblages of 2 or 3 species. Finally, for tidal swamps, we looked at Sitka spruce-dominated swamps versus a couple of other categories. Sample size is kind of low for some of these, but didn't really find any major differences among our tidal swamps. But again, important to note that overall, the tidal swamp carbon stocks are as high as tropical mangroves, which is a really cool finding of our work. Lastly, just wanted to show one slide where we're starting to look at spatial scale in variability as well. And Scott Bridgham, who you'll hear from at the end of our meeting, led the analysis here. What we did is we took all the cores and as much environmental data as we had, and we put those into a multivariate model called a boosted regression tree model. This is a machine learning approach that you'll hear a little bit more about today. And this looks, one of the nice outputs of this model is you can look at the relative importance of different factors. We grouped our environmental drivers into 2 major classes, those that kind of vary on the regional scale, such as latitude or climate zone, and then those that vary at smaller spatial scales, such as site level differences or the watershed scale. We ran this twice because we had kind of differing amounts of data. So for all cores across North America, the results are on the left, and for those cores that are just in California, Oregon, and Washington, we had more variables, but less samples. Those are on the right. But in both analyses, the major take-home message here is that most of the variability in carbon stocks seems to be driven by factors at the local scale. So the identity of the estuary, the elevation of the wetland, or the specific ecosystem type. So some closing thoughts before we move on to Katrina. One key one is that tidal swamps are an underappreciated ecosystem in the Pacific Northwest. They have very high carbon stocks, and we've lost most of those tidal wetlands. So conservation and restoration of those ecosystems is a really high priority for our region. The second is the slide I just showed, which is that spatial variation in stocks may be driven more by local factors, such as elevation or the specific estuary of interest, than by some of these larger regional scale climate gradients. And I think that our work has led to a significant improvement in our understanding of stocks across the region. 8 years ago, we had really not nearly this extensive of data or analyses. So I think we've made a lot of progress regionally in understanding blue carbon stocks. So with that, I'm going to hand the time over to Katrina.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Katrina Poppe, and I work at Western Washington University, and I'm a student at University of British Columbia. And for the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about patterns and predictors of soil carbon accumulation rates across these multiple Pacific Northwest estuaries. So our blue carbon working group identified a few key data gaps a few years ago that were sort of preventing us from doing things like a full feasibility assessments for blue carbon finance projects, because we were missing particularly carbon accumulation rates and greenhouse gas emissions, especially from sites that are not undisturbed marshes. Undisturbed marshes tend to be the best studied. So with our most recent projects, the goal, one of the goals was to measure a variety of sites to help fill those data gaps in our region with both carbon accumulation rates and greenhouse gas emission rates, and combine those two to then estimate the net effect of these wetlands on the climate and estimate the climate impact of restoration in our region. So I'll get into how we measured and interpreted the soil carbon accumulation rates, but since that's only one piece of the puzzle, Trevor and Scott will talk later about some other pieces. So Chris talked before me about our regional soil core database and some carbon stock results. And I'm going to talk more about core data as well, but I just wanted to give to like briefly mention the difference between carbon stocks and carbon accumulation rates, because they have different uses, but both give us valuable pieces of information. So carbon stocks here on the left are essentially how much carbon is currently stored in the soil, which has implications for how much carbon might potentially be lost or re-emitted to the atmosphere if that ecosystem were somehow degraded. But I'll be focusing on carbon accumulation rates, which is how much carbon is stored per year. So on a year-to-year basis, what is the role of that ecosystem in the carbon cycle? And here's how we calculate carbon accumulation rates from our soil core data. It's simply the product of how much carbon is, carbon density, how much carbon is stored in the soil, multiplied by the vertical accretion rate, how quickly is that soil accumulating, to give us carbon accumulation rates, or how quickly is that carbon accumulating. And for that middle accretion piece, we actually measured, for these studies, we measured accretion in 3 different ways, because although radiometric methods like lead-210 dating are sort of the standard for long-term accretion rates, we know from experience that this often doesn't work in soils that have been disturbed at some point, which kind of prevents us from studying many diked or restored sites, which prevents us from estimating the climate impact of restoration. So for these studies, we also used surface elevation tables or sets, and also feldspar markers. So sort of 3 different ways of getting accretion at many of these sites. And we've come up with a way to use set rates in place of lead-210 accretion rates, since indeed we found that lead-210 dating didn't work at some of our sites. But we can't just replace one rate with the other, 1-to-1, because they represent slightly different depths and different timescales. So we found that our set rates of elevation change for these studies tend to be roughly 4 times higher than the lead-210 rates. So that's a decent difference. So what we're doing is using an empirical linear relationship between the 2 rates as a way of sort of correcting the set rates to be able to calculate carbon accumulation rates from all our sites. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's the best that we've figured out how to do so far. So some results here are carbon accumulation rates from all these sites across the region, zoomed out. So the rates range from -35 to 300 grams of carbon per square meter per year. So it's a big range. And the median at the undisturbed sites, including swamps and marshes, is just below 100 grams of carbon per square meter per year, which is comparable, if not slightly lower than reported global averages. And so although, as I mentioned earlier, carbon accumulation rates are the product of both accretion rates and soil carbon density, we're finding that accretion seems to have greater influence, shown on the left. There's a much tighter relationship there. In other words, carbon density itself are a poor predictor of carbon accumulation rates, shown on the right. So if we want to maximize carbon accumulation rates, that can best be achieved by maximizing accretion rates, which also has the very important co-benefit of providing resilience to sea level rise. And here are some of our results across wetland types, so soil carbon density and accretion rates, and I'll talk about carbon accumulation rates next. The results for carbon density and accretion rates are, you can see they're kind of, the patterns are kind of inverse of each other. For example, carbon density tends to be lowest in restored marshes, while accretion rates tend to be highest in restored marshes, because these sites are often recovering from elevation loss that happened while they were diked. And then for the resulting carbon accumulation rates, the patterns are looking similar to the accretion rates, with the highest rates in restored marshes, since, as I mentioned, accretion is more predictive of carbon accumulation rates in our region, at least. And I have the median values shown here, and it's looking like, as expected, diked pastures have lower rates of carbon accumulation than reference wetlands because they are not receiving the sediment inputs from tidewaters, while restored sites have higher rates because they are often recovering from subsidence. But overall, we can sort of roughly conclude that restoring a diked pasture will roughly double the carbon accumulation rate here, at least initially. So those are some overall patterns we're seeing so far. Now, we've also done a bit of an analysis of environmental drivers of carbon accumulation rates, including both site scale and estuary scale, predictor variables listed here. And just some quick results on that. We used a linear mixed effects model to sort of sift through all these variables. And we found that the best model includes groundwater level, wetland type, and relative sea level rise. And the combination of these three explains about 50% of the variability in carbon accumulation rates, which is not bad for an ecological model. But I want to note, though, that water level is also an important driver of methane emissions, and methane can negate the climate benefit of carbon sequestration to some degree. So a high water level is not necessarily good in the grand scheme of things, but Trevor and Scott may touch more on that and the management implications after me. So to quickly summarize, we're finding that we can use alternative methods to measure accretion to help us fill these data gaps in disturbed and restored wetlands, especially. We're finding that accretion rates are more predictive of carbon accumulation rates than carbon density in our region. So if we want to maximize carbon accumulation rates, we want to optimize accretion. Carbon accumulation rates are highest in restored sites, roughly doubling when you go from a diked pasture to a restored marsh because of those accretion rates. Carbon accumulation rates are best predicted by water level, wetland type, and relative sea level rise. And then just a next step in terms of research is going to be to differentiate between autochthonous versus allochthonous sources of soil carbon. In other words, to identify what ecosystem actually removed that carbon from the atmosphere, because that can be different from the ecosystem where it ends up stored in the soil. And this can have implications for the role of these wetlands in the carbon cycle, and also whether it's feasible to use carbon finance strategies to fund tidal wetland restoration projects. So that's it for me. I think I'm going to pass it off next to Trevor, who will be talking about greenhouse gas fluxes.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. I learned a lot. I still don't know how to pronounce autochthonous or the other one. My name's Trev. I'm from OSU, and I'll be going over some results and briefly the methods for this multi-year collaborative project. We have a paper coming out soon titled A Regional Assessment of Methane and Nitrous Oxide Emissions from Reference Restored and Disturbed Estuarine Wetlands in the Pacific Northwest. So we conducted field work between 2021 and 2022 for this project. And like all these projects, they were amazing collaborations with all these folks and more. So thank you to everyone who helped out on this project. And thanks also to our funders at NOAA and the Science Collaborative Program. So as mentioned before, this portion of the project fills greenhouse gas data gaps from tidal wetland restoration and reference sites in our region. And we want to include freshwater sites specifically because those are impacted by invasive plants, including reed canary grass. So as we've gone over in this meeting so far, tidal wetlands have the potential to store great amounts of carbon, but we also know that methane can be emitted by natural processes in tidal wetlands. So we want to know a few questions, include the answers to a few questions, including, are there differences in methane production between wetland types? If so, what are the drivers or the conditions that are causing increased methane? This is our region. You've seen some maps before, but we're kind of all working in the same wetlands and estuaries. So we had 5 estuaries, 5 wetland types that we were looking at, 34 sites total. We did 6 measurement points per site, and we sampled each point 8 to 9 times between spring 2021 and 2022. We used this closed chamber portable gas analyzer method, which is quite common for this kind of work. So these collars are inserted into the soil, and we can get a continuous concentration and calculate flux that way. And flux is basically the amount of gas by the specific area by time. And in this project, we wanted to incorporate plants as they grew as much as possible. So we constructed these translucent chambers and stacked them on top of each other. We had mixing fans within those chambers to allow us to get a good mixing of our sample. And it allowed light to filter through, so the plants, for as much as possible, were just doing their thing. So we also took continuous and spot measurements of potential drivers, including groundwater level, rate and direction, salinity, temperature and pH, air temperature and pressure, soil temperature and soil surface elevation. And we also did some plant metrics that we won't get to today, but those will be in the paper if you want to check those out. And again, we used a boosted regression tree model to find influences on greenhouse gas flux. And that's basically a multivariate regression model powered by machine learning. So these are some of our results. We have our wetland types here at the bottom: reference swamp, reference marsh, restored marsh, wet pasture, and dry pasture. And we found that the highest methane emitted on average, and our highest points were in restored and wet pastures. And those were significantly higher than our other wetland classes. The dry pasture sites had the lowest methane emissions. And we also looked at the 2 seasons here in the Pacific Northwest, the rainy season and then our drought season. Methane was slightly higher in the dry season, except in our pasture sites. So these spot measurements gave us a lot of data to feed into the boosted regression tree model, which gives us an understanding with some confidence about what factors are actually at play influencing methane. So we found that these 3 factors were the most influential: the elevation of the wetland itself, the salinity at the time of measurement, and the water table level. So we're talking about soil saturation and salinity, which can both affect the amount of available oxygen that the bacteria that are producing methane have available to them, and also the availability of sulfur substrates, which allow for methanogenesis as well. This is another snapshot just to give you an idea of the model output, some patterns that we saw. Focused on individually, we have like increasing salinity, decreasing methane. We have more of a bell shape with wetland elevation, and with increasing water table level, increases in methane as well. So we found that using a boosted regression tree model, we can use that to estimate methane fluxes in coastal tidal wetlands of the Pacific Northwest if you provide it with enough training using all of these factors that we co-measured. So we had all these continuous measurements going all year long, but only spot measurements of methane. But this gives us some confidence that with those continuous measurements, we can get a good picture of what's going on in each wetland. So this is a bit of the annual analysis that we did. These are annual predictions, just to give you a sense of what those look like, and coupled those with the salinity concentration. So more of what I was showing earlier: drier pastures, fresher, lower methane production. And then we have methane being produced at higher salinities, higher definitely in the restored sites versus the reference marshes, but still being produced. So that gives us an underscoring that other factors are at play with methane production in these systems. I think that was really fast, but that's okay. That'll give Scott enough time to talk about the next piece of the puzzle. So thanks for your time. We should have a paper out very soon. Scott's going to be the corresponding author on that one, and you can email me as well if you have any questions about this research. So I'll hand it over to Scott, who will talk a little bit about net ecosystem carbon balances. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about land use effects on climate forcing in Pacific Northwest tidal wetlands. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Oregon, and I've been working in wetlands for close to 40 years now. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, in particular Katrina and Trevor, who, as you'll see, I will follow up on their results. First, I have to give a couple definitions here. The radiative balance is simply the difference between the methane flux in a wetland and the soil carbon sequestration. So the methane flux, at least if it's positive to the atmosphere, is a warming effect from the wetland. And soil carbon sequestration by removing CO2 from the atmosphere has a cooling effect. And the difference between those is the climate effect. But to compare apples to apples, I have to convert the CO2 into CO2 equivalents, or we do. And for methane, that means you have to multiply it by the sustained global warming potential, because it's a very potent greenhouse gas relative to CO2. And it matters a lot of the time frame by which you do this, because methane has a short lifetime in the atmosphere relative to CO2. So the sustained global warming potential for methane is 96 at 20 years and about half that, 45 at 100 years. Now, the radiating forcing is a climate effect of some management, and it's the change in the radiative balance over time. So pertinent for this talk is going to be the change in the radiative balance going from a degraded condition to a restored condition in a wetland. As the previous speakers have discussed, we did a regional evaluation of greenhouse gas effects of estuarine wetland restoration by measuring greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration in 3 different management types: reference, restored, and disturbed conditions, cross salinity gradients, and 5 estuaries in the Pacific Northwest. This table shows the distribution of sampling sites and sort of how I divided them up. So the first 4 rows in the table are different reft marshes. So fresh oligohaline, mesohaline, polyhaline, and swamps and fresh oligohaline and salinity. Then we have 2 restored conditions, restored types, fresh oligohaline and mesopolyhaline. I'm going to just call these oligohaline or polyhaline so I don't get too tongue-tied. And then 2 disturbed types, wet and dry pasture. So you can see for methane emissions, we have 36 sites divided up reasonably well among the categories. For soil carbon accumulation, or CAR, we only have 30 sites. We're trying to get the rest of those values here in the next couple of months. But in particular, important for today, you can see for the wet and dry pasture sites, we only have 2 replicates of each of those. And as you'll see, the highest methane emitting wet pasture site, we don't have CAR data for, and that will be a problem in interpretation, which I will talk about in a few minutes. So obviously, for the radiative balance, we can only have the number of sites that we have in both these variables. So here we're looking at methane fluxes as grams CO2 equivalents per meter squared per year. And in this case, we're using the 100-year sustained global warming potential. And if you use the 20-year sustained global warming potential, it would be about twice this on the y-axis. So you can see that there's huge variation here in methane emissions across the sites, from negative to about 20,000. And additionally, all the slides are sort of set up this way, where the first, going from left to right, the first 4 categories in the x-axis are different kinds of reference marshes. So we have oligohaline marshes, mesohaline marshes, and polyhaline marshes, and then swamps. And then the 2 middle categories in blue are restored, oligohaline and polyhaline. And then on the right in red are wet and dry pastures. So you can see the variability in this is largely driven by the very high emissions in the oligohaline restored sites. But there's also one oligohaline reference site, which has high methane emissions here, and then one site over here in the wet pasture, which had very high methane emissions. And as you can see, there's a note there that says no car data, and we're attempting to get that. But right now, since we don't have car data there, we won't be able to estimate the radiative balance for this high methane emitting wet pasture site. So here is showing the sediment carbon accumulation rates in the same units for methane as for methane, but note that we're only going from 0 to 1,000 here, so a lot less variability. And Katrina largely showed the same results with a little bit of somewhat different sites. But you could see that the oligohaline restored higher carbon accumulation rates than the wet and dry pastures. So now we're looking at the 20-year radiative balance. And in this case, positive numbers indicate methane emissions outweigh soil carbon sequestration. That is, there's a net warming effect. And you could see that this radiative balance is strongly driven by the methane emissions with their high variability. And this is the same graph. I just lopped off the highest methane emitting oligohaline restored site, so we could see the other ones a little bit better. And you can see that most of the reference sites actually have a negative radiative balance of 20 years, even with a very high methane sustained global warming potential. Most of the polyhaline restored sites, though, have a positive effect, and the wet and dry pastures are close to the 0 line, but again, we're missing the CARB value for the high methane emitting site, and that probably would be someplace up here, so that would have a very large warming effect. So this is the same type of data, only now looking at the 100-year sustained global warming, 100-year balance. And you could see essentially it looks like the 20-year one, only there's the y-axis is about half what it was in the previous one. Excuse me. And then this is the same graph, only now again we've lopped off the highest methane emitting oligohaline restored site. And so now if you look in green at the reference site, you can see all of these have a cooling effect except for one oligohaline reference marsh. Additionally, most of the polyhaline restored sites have a cooling effect, as do for the wet and dry pastures that are shown. But again, we have one wet pasture site which has very high methane emissions, and when we get the CAR data, it will be someplace up here. So let's think briefly about what the management effects would be, and that is the radiative forcing, which is the change in the balance due to management effects. And here we're largely talking about going from these wet or dry pasture conditions to these restored conditions. And so you can see that largely if you went from the wet or dry pasture to a polyhaline restored site, there would be a net cooling effect. And again, the wet pasture site with very high methane emissions, as shown here, would be up around here when we get the CAR data, is that would have actually a large cooling effect, which means becoming more negative on the graph. However, if you restore these to the oligohaline restored condition, then in many cases there would be a substantial warming effect. However, it's interesting to think about these restored sites relative to the reference sites, and you could see that they have much lower 100-year radiative balances relative to their coparts at the same salinity. And that's largely because these restored wetlands often are at a much lower elevation because they have subsided when through disturbance. And so if they're either managed to have higher initial elevation, or if they gain elevation through time, through sediment accretion, then you would expect them to become more similar to the reference sites over time. And even the lithohaline restored sites may eventually have a positive climate benefit if given enough time. Additionally, for the swamp sites, we're only considering soil carbon sequestration here, but as Chris showed, they have a substantial amount of woody bio, and that could be a large amount of soil carbon sequestration there that we're not considering in this. So then to conclude, the variability in methane fluxes dominates the carbon balance of these tidal wetlands. And this variability can't be explained solely by salinity classes. Other things such as water table are also quite important. Restoration often results in low elevation sites that have high methane emissions. Prioritizing saline wetland restoration and hydrologic alterations that result in lower water tables, such as adding fill or providing channels for rapid tide rider removal, or maybe simply just time at sediment creek, result in lower methane emissions. Restoration of wet pastures to polyhaline tidal sites is most promising from a climate enforcement perspective. The difficulty of reliably measuring sediment carbon accumulation in restored sites is a major obstacle in estimating the carbon balance. And you can see here I have in small type unless you have eddy flux towers, but that would be prohibitively expensive with the regional approach that we took. Future research should focus on horizontal gas fluxes, which would be quite large for CO2 and methane in tidal wetlands. And as Katrina said, allochthonous versus autochthonous carbon, which is one of our next projects. And so thanks and acknowledgments to collaborators and to funding. And I think that after me, that we're in now a...
Thanks, folks. All right. That is the end of the presentation time. So we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A, and there are just so many questions coming in, but do keep them coming because we will try to pass them on to presenters after the session ends if we don't get through all of them. If you didn't already see, Q&A is open to everybody. So there's a few questions that already got answered, and you can see the answers to them there, and anybody, presenters can feel free to add on to those if you want to add more to them, and otherwise I'll just keep rolling with the ones that have come in. Okay, so first question. In Great Bay, the Spartina stems are patchily distributed by the tides, often in dense mats in some areas. Vegetative growth is suffocated and thinly in other areas. How did the sampling strategy account for patchiness?
I think that question may have, I'm not totally sure, may have been directed to Trevor with the gas emissions data. So I'll just say that we had 6 chambers per site in the study, and we did, I think we accounted for some of that patchiness in plant communities. And we had a site, for example, dominated by Carex lingbii, but had a few open areas. And I know we had 1 or 2 chambers that kind of fell into those areas. So I don't know if Trevor or Scott want to elaborate on that a little more.
Yeah, we did transects away from the major waterway to intentionally sort of measure the hydrologic variability within the site. And then after that, it was basically random along a transect. And I think with a regional approach like this, we don't capture variability greater than any single site, but what we do, and was the intention, is to capture regional variability. And hopefully we've done a reasonably good job with our sampling scheme with across all the different sites. So if you have 36 sites times 6 chambers per site, you can see that we had lots of chambers in very different kinds of vegetation community across the whole study. But we intentionally have not, in the paper, we look a little bit at plants, but not too extensively, because the study wasn't designed to look at plant effects on methane per se.
Scott, question for you. What is the restoration age range, so time since restoration, for the polyhaline and oligohaline restored sites included here?
They varied from about a year to, and Chris, what is it, 30 or 40 years?
I think, oh gosh, our oldest sites were probably about 25 years. I think our Frederickson site.
Okay, so yeah, it'd be the early 1990s, I think, were the older sites.
Another question for Scott. You're popular today. Given the results of the radiative balance, how would you respond to the possible criticism that over a 100-year time frame, restoration of these ecosystems for climate benefits alone does not appear to be worth the effort, and resources would be better used on protection of reference sites or on other methods to draw down carbon?
In general, I would say that protection of existing sites is always really important, and particularly if they have high soil carbon, because if you lose that soil carbon, it's a really major emission to the atmosphere of CO2. So I would always prioritize protection. In terms of these fresh and oligohaline restored sites, I do think there are management activities that you could try to do to reduce the methane emissions, and I discussed some of them. Either initially or over time, you would expect as they rapidly creep, because they do very rapidly rise in tidal elevation, that should eventually their methane emissions should decrease. But on the other hand, there are lots of ecosystem benefits from these oligohaline marshes, and I think we're often these days focused on carbon balances and climate forcing, but certainly locally, the other ecological benefits of these sites, I think, are really way more important than it's my personal opinion. But if you're doing it intentionally, for example, for carbon credits or something like that, then these results are really highly hurt.
Okay, a couple questions left here. I got a few minutes left, so let's see if we can get through both of them. I'll be doing a similar webinar on blue carbon soon. What take-home messages do you think most stakeholders need to know, and what parameters are the most significant as my organization collects data on blue carbon systems? So good take-home messages.
Katrina, why don't you answer this?
Maybe just that one is that many take-home messages, but we could like take home very different sort of conclusions on management implications if we just focus on stocks versus carbon accumulation rates versus greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're finding that it's important to measure all of them to understand sort of the different considerations in managing for carbon. But I would also just reiterate what Scott said about it can get really into the details about the carbon, but we still want to be restoring these ecosystems. They're so important for other reasons too. So it could, maybe there are ways that we can sort of like, if we're restoring, maybe there are ways that we can accelerate that trajectory towards lowering carbon emissions by adding sediment or increasing channel networks. But I think we should still be focusing on restoration for other reasons.
Anybody else have a take-home they want to share? If not, I'll move on to the next one.
Just a quick response to that one. It's tough to say what parameters are most significant without knowing what other data might be available in this person's region. So figuring out what's missing, might be one place to start and start filling some data gaps.
Also good advice. Another question for Scott looks like charting restoration effects is difficult because of the extended recovery times. Do you have a sense of recovery age that is necessary to yield stable results? In forests, it can take a century or more to produce an inch of soil.
No, I don't yet. We're at the process of, and sort of our next projects are more model oriented, where we begin thinking about some of these things, also including things like sea level rise within those. Is, but I will say that many of these restored sites, as Katrina showed, accrete sediments very rapidly. So, I think up to like maybe a centimeter or more per year. Is that correct, Katrina?
Yeah, the restored sites, yeah, sometimes 1, maybe 2, even 3 centimeters per year initially.
Yeah. So, so it doesn't take 100 years to accumulate a whole lot of elevation in some of these sites. They are accumulating an inch in several years in some of them. So I think it's more rapid, that moving up in the tidal frame than the question presented in many of our sites.
Yeah, I think I'll just add the point that I think what we don't really know is how rapidly soil and groundwater conditions change. So we've I would say only within the last decade or 15 years have really started to monitor groundwater in tidal wetlands in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't think we have a good sense of how that water table is changing over time. Presumably as the wetland gains elevation, its water table will be more similar to a reference site, which Trevor showed had pretty low methane emissions. But I don't think we have good empirical data on that yet.
We are about out of time. I saw Laura Brophy added a comment, and she's one of the collaborators in some of this work, so I'll read it out loud. Another important take-home for land managers and policymakers: simplistic approaches such as national averages or assumptions made about methane emissions based only on salinity won't work well for estimating carbon functions or climate benefits. Careful study within each distinct region and ecosystem type is needed to provide rigorous data to support carbon finance. So another take-home for those looking for take-homes. We are out of time, so thank you to our presenters for taking the time to be with us today and putting together those great presentations and answering questions. If you have other questions as we're wrapping up, feel free to drop them into the exit survey, which will open automatically as you leave the session. And thank you all for being with us today. Take care.